Coming up on the Civil Discourse, Redfield Jamison, writer and professor of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, discusses her lifelong study of mood disorders and her own struggle with mental illness.
I think overwhelmingly what people don't realize is how treatable mood disorders are, depression and bipolar illness both. They may take a while and they may be frustrating to treat and it may take longer than people would like, but they are treatable. And it's very important for people to know that. And suicide is so disproportionately associated with depression and bipolar illness that it's important to say, to extend hope.
Hello, I'm Paula Marantz Cohen, host of the Civil Discourse and dean at Drexel University, speaking to you from Philadelphia. The goal of the Civil Discourse is to introduce our viewers to guests with diverse opinions and life experiences. They are all accomplished people who can help us think more critically and empathetically about the world we live in. Today, my guest is Redfield Jamison, a professor of psychiatry and mood disorders at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. Dr. Jamison, a MacArthur Genius Award winner, is a tireless advocate for the research and treatment of mental illness. She's written many books, some of which deal candidly with her own experience with bipolar disorder. Her latest book is Fires in the Dark, Healing the Unquiet Mind, a wide-ranging study of the art of mental healing. I want to alert our audience to the fact that we will be talking about suicide at one point in this episode. Dr. Jamison, welcome to the Civil Discourse.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So your first book, An Unquiet Mind, to which your latest book makes a reference in its title, spoke in eloquent detail about your experience, your struggle, your coming to terms with bipolar disorder, which you prefer to call manic depression, which is the older term. And I wanted to ask you why you prefer manic depression to the more recent bipolar.
I prefer it. I should say I use bipolar disorder or bipolar illness because it is the standard in the field and it would be confusing not to use it. So that particular train's left the station. But I think that it's important to realize that bipolar illness is a fluctuating illness. And when you say bipolar, it implies there's mania tidally over on one pole and depression over on the other, that they're somehow separated. And what we know is that they fluctuate and mix and merge a lot. Also, we know that people who have recurrent depression are much more likely people who have bipolar illness in terms of their family history, in terms of the course of their illness, in terms of their treatment. So it's the Europeans always use manic depressive illness to include recurrent depression as well. And I think in a way, bipolar kind of trivializes it, makes it seem a little bit less bad than it is. But, I think people obviously should call themselves whatever they want to call themselves. And the clinical term now is bipolar disorder.
Okay, well, that's a very interesting explanation, which I hadn't quite understood, but it makes sense, and especially the relationship to recurrent depression. So I want to talk about that early book because it was so important in culture, and I guess in your life as well, because you had different kinds of responses to it. I mean, you mentioned, I believe, that there were people that were very outraged by it and upset by it, and then others that, of course, found it extraordinary that they could identify with what you went through and felt relieved that you had described it. Can you explain those two different responses? Do you think our culture or our society has moved to a point now where you would not get the first response now?
I honestly don't know. I would say certainly the culture has moved in terms of, I think, of being more understanding and also better informed and educated. I got a lot of people who were just vitriolic on the subject of mental illness in general. And because I was in the public eye at that time, I got it. I think a lot of people have gotten it. And I think we have, a very divisive society. And at the time, people both frightened of and alarmed by mental illness. I mean, overwhelmingly, people were supportive.
Yeah.
My colleagues were supportive, and the people who read the book, I felt enormous kindness and gentleness and support. So it would be remiss to focus on the negative, except the negative is very frightening. It's a scary business. There are a lot of people out there who just really are afraid or don't like the mentally ill.
Yeah. And I think that persists in different forms now. But getting back to your own story, I mean, you've always been, from girlhood, a high achiever, enormously high achiever. And was this a function of your being manic? I mean, you talk about this a little bit. I mean, some people would say superficially that this was a gift. Look at what you were able to accomplish. Can you address that and explain the paradox?
Sure. I certainly wouldn't say it was a gift. I would say that there were times when I was mildly manic, when I got a lot of things done, some good, some not so good. Overwhelmingly, it's a debilitating illness. It's a painful illness. It's one that's highly associated with suicide if it's left untreated. It's highly associated with alcohol and drug use. I was very lucky, and I think one of the things I feel very strongly is, I think a lot of advocates do, if you've been fortunate enough to get through it and have the resources that I had and the medical care that I had, and to be able to afford it, even though it certainly cost me quite a bit in a lot of ways, that I feel very fortunate in how I got this illness. And so many people are not. And so many people, as you say, aren't able to function, aren't able to work, are brought down by despair. And I think for those people, the people who are more able to get out and about and advocate, it's an important thing to do.
Well, yeah, and that gratitude comes through in your books, and in your most recent book particularly. I want to talk just briefly about Night Falls Fast, which is your study of suicide, which you mentioned, and you yourself struggled and tried several times to commit suicide. When we hear of suicide, it can sometimes occur when people think that the person has been stabilized or that they're on the upswing. Can you give us some cues or some thoughts about how you can tell when you think someone is doing well, when they might be suicidal?
Well, I think it's important. I mean, whether you're, teaching residents to try and understand or recognize severe suicidal thinking in their patients, or whether you're talking to family members, that it's hard. There aren't any easy answers. If there were easy answers, it wouldn't be such a difficult subject. I think that what you can do always is ask people. There's this kind of feeling out in the public sometimes that if you ask people about suicide, you're somehow going to put the idea in their heads to make it more likely that they will commit suicide. And in fact, I think it's just really important to say, I know you're feeling better. You look great. I don't want to be invasive of your privacy, but I do want to make sure that I care. And what is it that I can do? And have you been feeling suicidal? Because these things are, I think, overwhelmingly what people don't realize is how treatable mood disorders are, depression and bipolar illness both. They may take a while, and they may be frustrating to treat, and it may take longer than people would like, but they are treatable. And it's very important for people to know that. And suicide is so disproportionately associated with depression and bipolar illness that it's important to extend hope. But there's a lot that can be done. And what can I do to help?
Yeah, what I love about your book, so about your own story, is how ultimately you feel you represent for readers how treatable this can be, though, of course, there can be a circuitous route to coming to that right treatment. In your 2009 book, Nothing Was the Same, you deal with the death of your first husband from cancer, and you make a comparison between grief and depression. Can you explain the difference, and does grief sometimes turn into chronic depression?
I think grief comes to us all.
Yeah.
We're all going to lose someone we deeply care about, and we're going to be hit like a ton of bricks, and it's going to go through that kind of cyclic sort of thing where you think you're getting over it, and then all of a sudden you're hit once again by the pain and the missing. But what society does is it extends its arms to people who are grieving. It's because it's so ancient and so much a part of human nature and human experience. People, I think, reach out more and they know a little bit more what to do. Depression is so alienating. It puts people off. I mean, people feel either that kind of contagious sense of being depressed around somebody who's depressed, or they feel like they hopeless, or that they just don't know what to do. And again, I think, and they're very different. I think, as you say, as you ask, is certainly grief can turn into depression, particularly in people who are predisposed to depression. Okay? And it's important to handle both of them, psychotherapy, medication, combination of those things. But I think, again, with depression, because it's so hard to reach out, just ask people, is there anything I can do? What helps? What doesn't help? What do I do that irritates you? Because people who are depressed are irritable. I mean, that's almost part of, they're suspicious, they're irritable. They don't present their best faces forward, and I think you want to extend yourself as much as you can. It's easier said than done sometimes.
Yeah, it's interesting about grief, as you said, it seems it's circumscribed, or at least we expect it to be. And the problem with depression, but this can be true of grief as well, is that it goes on and on and on sometimes, and the person on the other end is worn down and gets irritable on their end because they have to deal with someone who is not fun.
Right. And I think the difference, Graham Greene said once that one of the differences with melancholy, you have no reason for your depression. Otherwise you do, and the difference is that if you have a reason for your depression, even if it's terrible to experience, it's less overwhelming. And you can kind of see yourself getting through it eventually, even if you're feeling hopeless.
Yeah. You wrote a book on Robert Lowell, the great New England poet. It's called Robert Lowell, Setting the River on Fire, A Study of Genius, Mania, and Character. I was very taken with this book. I happen to have read Life Studies when I was in high school during a summer, and I found his poems extraordinarily moving. And they are about some of them, Lowell's treatment for manic depression, which he suffered as you did. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and whether you identify with him in that sense.
Well, I wish I could say I identify with him. I think that Lowell was an undisputed genius in his intellect in general, and obviously with his poetry, and hugely original. What I could say about Lowell is I identified with him in the sense that when I was in high school as well, my high school English teacher, I had my first breakdown when I was about 17, and he gave me a couple of volumes, including Life Studies, to read. And he said, I think you might find Robert Lowell interesting. And he never said, are you depressed or anything like that. He just said, I think you might find these poems interesting. And I have owed a huge debt to Robert Lowell ever since. He went into my soul in a way in which it's just hard to imagine. It's partly the age, I suppose, but mainly the poetry. And I've never gotten those poems out of my soul and heart. And I was privileged to be able to look at his medical records and psychiatric records. His daughter was kind enough to give me permission to do that and to spend several years in his company. And I've tried to understand him. I've taught him with residents and medical students and graduate students. I've used his work because I think he can describe mania, can describe suicide, depression in a way which someone who hasn't that extraordinary gift with words.
I love that idea that you teach Lowell's poetry to residents.
I do, and actually we've had a couple of concerts and readings around Lowell. He's just a remarkable man, and I admired his courage. Very controversial in a lot of ways. He acted abominably when he was manic. No question.
He could be very nasty, yes, to the people he loved.
And people who get manic are very often very, sharp with their words and behavior. But he always tried to restore his relationships, and he had very close friendships. And I admire the courage to keep on going, given how public his madness was. He got back in and taught. He got back in and wrote. He got back in and got involved in relationships. And I think that aspect of character is quite phenomenal.
Yeah. So your latest book, Fires in the Dark, you look at artists and healers who have helped us cope with life. And there are two doctors who figure as central, W.H. Rivers.
W.H.R. Rivers.
Yeah, W.H.R. Rivers.
His second R is Rivers, so it's Rivers.
Rivers. I love that. And Sir William Osler, one of the giants of modern medicine.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could talk to us a bit about your reverence for medicine. Tell me about your sense of what are the gifts that medicine has given us, and particularly in terms of psychiatry, and what are the deficits or the downside?
One of the things I tried to emphasize in Fires in the Dark is the ancient origins of psychiatry and psychotherapy in particular that came about from the priests. And that again, that its human nature goes back long, long before we had treatments, long before we had any understanding of the brain or really of behavior. And I think that is the aspect of medicine that in many respects stays. I mean, there's a sense of hope giving, of consolation, of accompaniment, that if you're a psychotherapist and you are on a journey with someone who is very ill, it is that accompaniment plus competence. Yeah. And I think that's the best side of psychology and psychiatry, is that people can extend that kind of confessional relationship that went with priesthood, that kind of healing, laying on of hands that went with priesthood, with modern medicine and science. And we know a lot. I mean, with mood disorders, we know an incredible amount scientifically. There's a kind of misconception that these are kind of airy-fairy diseases and are just subjective and so forth. But we know a tremendous amount about that. And I think that a good doctor is as good as it gets.
Do you think, Dr. Jamison, that we are losing some of that priestliness, that art that you refer to, that ability to be with the patient in the way in which modern medicine is structured?
No question about it. And so I was getting down to the downside. The downside, I know very few doctors and clinicians who aren't extremely discontent with the way they're being asked to practice what they've been taught to do. And so I work in a hospital. It's a wonderful hospital, Johns Hopkins. But, it's gotten like all hospitals to just be, very focused on the number of people that you see. In many ways, I think Hopkins is able to hold on to some of the old aspects of caring and so forth. But there are very few doctors who aren't massively discontent and that aren't being kind of just homogenized out into providers, into all kind of care and everything's kind of mushed in there. And so that notion of being a priest doctor has just disintegrated. In psychiatry and psychology, social work, I mean, one of the things that you find is that there's so few people to practice, so it's one thing you can say to somebody you're talking with, well, get help,
Yeah.
or get treatment. And then there's a waiting list of 6 or 7 months, or more likely someone can't begin to afford the fees, or people won't take private insurance because they don't have to, because there's such a shortage.
Right.
It's a utterly broken healthcare system.
And let me add the problem with psychiatry, you have the psychiatrist giving the medication and the clinical psychologist or social worker doing the talking cure. And that to me is really dysfunctional. Do you agree with that?
I certainly agree that it can be dysfunctional. It can work very well. I think what the problem is that what I see is a lot of residents who would like to do a lot of psychotherapy because they went into psychiatry because they wanted to treat patients. They didn't want people. They didn't want just to prescribe pills. Is that they're being forced again to turn over that to other people. And so that incredibly, when it's done well, psychotherapy is such an extraordinary sort of thing. And when it's done badly or not at all, it's useless. And so I think what's happened is that people are being asked to do things that they really don't want to do. And mainly, to me, it's ultimately a political issue of what kind of healthcare system does the United States of America want? Do we want people who can't begin to get psychiatric care because they can't afford it or because it's not available?
It will hurt the society, and we need to change that. I so agree with you. And everyone.
And it's brutal. I mean, if you're a civilized country, you ought to be able to.
That is the problem with psychiatric care, because when you say there are methods of help, how to get at it, how to get through this morass, to find the right doctor, to get, seen, and then to afford it is so difficult. We're almost out of time, but I want to talk about writing as therapy. I'm a compulsive writer and have been all my life. And I look at what you have done and the amount of writing that you've done. And I wonder, and you may have said this somewhere in your writing, that writing for you has a therapeutic element to it. Tell us about that and what you feel as you write, because you've written on many subjects. They all deal in some ways with the mind. What does writing do for you? And are you always writing something?
With Unquiet Mind, it wasn't it wasn't therapeutic to write it. It was therapeutic to make the decision to write it, because it was so hard to think about losing privacy and risking jobs and all that kind of thing, and risking what other people would think. And I don't know how I would use the word therapeutic so much as I love to write. And I think I have a pretty scrambled brain that's kind of constantly off chasing rabbits across many fields. And writing forces you to rein that in and try and make some sense out of it. And I enjoy it. I enjoy it very much.
So it's not a painful process for you?
No, it's certainly not a painful process. And plus, I love the research side of it. I wrote a book about exuberance, and every day I'd wake up and be in the presence of somebody who bubbled over with life and loved life and so forth, or had some strange way of looking at the world.
That book, which deals with the idea that some people have that quality of exuberance, almost like a mild manic quality. Do you feel that there will be a time when we will have a safe drug that we can take so we can all be exuberant?
I think something shy of that. I think it's kind of a horrifying thought, because the idea of a world full of exuberant people is so chaotic and so.
We only want a certain number of them, right?
Well, exactly. And then one of the things I tried to point out in that particular book was that all the studies of animals and human beings show that maybe 20% of animals, or a particular species, including humans, is very exuberant, risk-taking, all over the place. And another 20% is shy and conservative and staying within the home territory. And the rest are kind of scattered throughout. And that makes perfect sense. You don't want everybody being unable to risk things, and you don't want everybody risking everything. You want some distribution.
And I would say that that's the sign of a good marriage, is when you have one of each type complementing each other.
Yes, probably so. Yeah.
But anyway, I think we are out of time. I have a few more questions I could ask you. You are certainly as eloquent in person as you are in your writing. I really recommend to our viewers that they check out your books, going back to your first book, which is so personal, and Unquiet Mind, which began this trajectory. So I want to thank you so much.
Great fan of Drexel, so thank you.
Well, thank you for joining us, and I want to thank our audience for joining us today on the Civil Discourse.